So for Throwback Thursday, I've been speaking about TV programmes, and I've also been speaking, as of now, I've been speaking about artists, and I'll also be now speaking about music albums and fashion icons. Fashion icons starts next week, because I wanted to do a bit more and get it more off the cuff instead of reading something. However, what I wanted to do is I'm going to start with the first 3 albums which have influenced me as a musician, and I'm going to start with the first one. So the first one, you may know, is number 1 is Michael Jackson's Thriller. Michael Jackson's Thriller. Well, first of all, most people know Michael Jackson's Thriller is the largest selling album of all music history. And Michael Jackson is a very controversial figure. There are people who understand the respect of his music, but also his personal life clouds that. However, I'm not going to go into his personal life. I'm always going to go into the music and what this music represents. So Michael Jackson, as you may know, has died about 12 years ago. But before then, Michael Jackson started off as a very young lad when he was 11, actually on the national stage, when he was with the Jackson 5 of Motown. They were the first group to have 4 #1 hits in a row. They were kind of like the first ever kind of boy band in that respect. Obviously the Beatles were, but in that sort of idea, because the Jackson 5 had a comic book series, they had a cartoon series, and Motown utilised that, and Michael Jackson was very exposed to that. So from a young age, he'd been in the Motown era in Los Angeles, saw these wonderful acts producing albums and so forth. But all the time as a child, he was always part of that group. And it got to all during the 70s, he was doing stuff with that. They left Motown in like 75, 76 and joined Epic Records to do the Jacksons' work. And again, they were still part of Gamble and Huff. And then in about 1979, they decided to do their first album called Destiny. Now, Destiny is the first album where Michael Jackson has a lot of the writing credits, and they produced the album with Greg Philagaines. And this sort of, sorry, it's not Greg Philagaines, it's the Triumph album, so I do apologise. But he was quite influential in that, in the musical side of it. And it actually, what influenced it as well was why Greg Philagaines and then the idea of Michael Jackson went to do The Wiz. He then got to meet Quincy Jones. And Quincy Jones and him did their first album together called Off the Wall. Now, most people would say, a lot of people in music history circles would say, Off the Wall is such a much better album, it's fresh, it's new. But the songs on it are very of its time. It was like the kind of bits of disco going into that mixture of 79 going into out of disco, and there is some good music on it. So the musicality of it is amazing, but the sounds of it are. It was the biggest selling album at the time. Sold 10 million albums, sold more than any Stevie Wonder album, all of them. But there was something which it hadn't hit with Michael Jackson's talent. Michael Jackson's talent was there, and after Off the Wall had failed, it was the precursor to why he wanted to create Thriller. Now, Thriller as an album wasn't actually produced. It was very much not a rush job. There was a lot of work within it, but it took a long time to get together. But it had to come out quickly, because what Michael Jackson was actually pressured with, and Quincy Jones, was to save the music industry. Most people would stop buying albums. Albums weren't selling on the units they were like they were in the 70s and 60s. So with this in mind, Michael Jackson wanted to create these epic masterpieces. And Michael Jackson in that album created 3 songs he wrote and helped co-produce. And there was also some of the people in this were using the best musicians at the time, who Quincy Jones had access to. So when we look at Thriller as an album, as a personal album, I like a lot of the tracks on Bad, and I like a lot of the tracks on Dangerous. But with Thriller, it's the 9 tracks of it is so conducive to who Michael Jackson became as a superstar in the 80s. And some people would say, oh, was it the music videos who made it? It's not, because the music videos are only a part of it. A lot of it, if you want to know more about the actual sounds they created, was Stories in the Room, Thriller, which is a Instagram channel and a YouTube channel. And Anthony Martorelli is one of the people who explains all the sounds he makes. It's really interesting. It's good worth looking at if you're into music. So when we're looking at the idea of and I'm going to just go into some of the notes here. So when we're looking at the ideas of Thriller, obviously being a 9-track album, Michael actually wanted it longer, and actually at that time, the first time they then played it to the executives, they were upset because it was too long, the sound was awful, and they had to remix all the tracks. So for starting off, most of this was produced in LA. It's a very LA sounding record, it's very upbeat, and it's at Westlake Audio, which was a very famous studio in LA. So the first track, Wanna Be Starting Something, was written by Michael Jackson. It is got the ideas of Paulino da Costa, who was probably the best percussionist in the world. He's actually got a solo album called Agora, which is amazing, because Brazilian percussionist. And a lot of this idea was, the idea of Don't Stop to Get Enough was this Latin influence, but Wanna Be Started Something when it goes the next stage over. And the idea of this song is actually all about, Wanna Be Started Something, it's about the idea of Michael Jackson's brothers and the families all arguing about different things in the family, and how they used to pick on LaToya, and that's what actually the song is about. And what Michael Jackson also wanted to do in this middle section, he wanted to create this African call and response chanting, which is actually it's an interpolation of a track by Hugo Marcazelli called, which is a very famous Cameroonian funk track. So Michael Jackson also did borrow ideas and stuff, but it's also how he made it his own. And another person as well, if you want to listen to his vocal ideas, is listen to a YouTube channel called Chris Lipe, and he shows all the vocal ideas and all the arrangements. It's quite interesting. So when we're looking at Michael Jackson, Wanna Be Starting Something is about that. Then he goes to Baby Be Mine, which is Rod Temperton, who wrote the famous hits Rock With You, Off the Wall, and Burn This Disco Out. Rod Temperton was the songwriter for Heatwave, and when he was doing this, Baby Be Mine and Thriller and Lady My Life are the 3 songs on this album. Baby Be Mine, again, very much an R&B song, but again, also the programming of this was very much a bouncy track. So everything about Thriller is upbeat. There's not many. It doesn't really go down. It's always, up tempo. Nothing really sad. Probably Lady of My Life is probably the most kind of poignant, sad song, but most of it is very upbeat, and it's why we call it pop perfection. The next track is The Girl Is Mine, which is a duet with Paul McCartney, which was written by Michael Jackson. It was the first song actually released off the album. Most people were quite disappointed, but there was a reason for it all. In fact, even if you actually look at the inlay, there is a drawing of Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney trying to fight over a girl. It's actually drawn by Michael Jackson. He was actually a very good artist as well. I've actually got some sketches of Michael Jackson which I keep framed and not to everybody's to have access to. And when you're looking at Girl Is Mine, this has got sort of an idea of this sort of... I've heard reggae versions, calypso versions, which are quite interesting. So again, very tongue-in-cheek, probably kind of a bit cheesy, a bit gimmicky, a bit gauche, but Michael Jackson could do that, and again, that's sort of like his persona, how he created that. The title track, Thriller, produced and written by Rod Temperton, is a song which actually at the time was very much pioneered a lot of techniques in recording techniques. It was probably one of the most multi-tracked tracks ever recorded at the time. So there was a lot of programming, a lot of effects, a lot of different techniques were used, and I think as a title track, it probably wasn't the most strongest of singles, but actually what it is, why it becomes culturally relevant, is that when Michael Jackson created the short film of Thriller, and how the music industry and the music company wouldn't support it, so Michael Jackson had to sell the making of it to MTV, and at the time when it actually did sell, the actual making of Thriller actually became the biggest selling VHS tape at the time, until Independence Day beat it in the 90s. So it was a very much a very influential, this is where the influence comes from. It's this influential idea of being able to show that music video could work with songs, so the visual idea of this. And Michael had these ideas in his mind. So when people think Michael Jackson's just a singer or a songwriter, he's also very much a visual artist as well. And Thriller as a song, probably not my favourite, but there's some great ideas of it, and there's also a version of it, if you want to hear the original, called Starlight, which is kind of like a musical twee idea. I prefer this Thriller idea. I think it's more fun and tongue-in-cheek. And then we come to some of the big hitters. So Michael Jackson's written Beat It, which is basically Quincy Jones wanted their version of My Sharona, and Michael Jackson's talking about the idea of gang fighting, and obviously this was very prominent in LA at the time. In fact, even the music video had gang members. How true that is, I don't know, but it was all filmed in Skid Row, so probably likely. Beat It is the idea of not getting into violence. It's an anti-violence song, and the idea of this was also quite interesting because it was very minimal, but it also had an idea of this mixing of the rock element, and I think it was done purposely as well, because the rock element of had Eddie Van Halen, because MTV before then wouldn't play black artists. So the idea of having a song like Beat It with this rock guitar, it would also, and this is what actually happened to it, is the song was popular not with only black audience, but it was actually popular with white audience who liked the rock element. So these are kind of strategic ideas of how you can change things as an influence. So Beat It, which is very iconic. Is it a song I like now as an adult? As a child I liked it more. My favourite song, which is actually the next four, I really like, and I think the B-side of Thriller, I think, is probably pop perfection in my opinion, is Billie Jean, and I think probably Michael Jackson's most iconic song. Billie Jean is, though it's actually such an upbeat song, it's actually about an idea of a stalker who was supposed to be, accordingly, went into Michael Jackson's back swimming pool and was arrested and claimed he was the father of her two twins. Yeah, so, quite a scary moment. It probably talks about this idea of paranoia of Michael Jackson about being famous, but also having the issues of dealing with this. So Billie Jean is got so many elements of it, which is, again, the programming, some of the sounds were unique. But also, we also can look at Billie Jean as a song which is how you can write something in a negative key, but also have this upbeat meaning to it. Actually, listen to the lyrics. It's actually quite frightening what's going on in the song. But Billie Jean is a very iconic song, and I think what Michael Jackson did was the idea of ear candies. When we think of it in producers, is as soon as we hear that backbeat of Billie Jean, we know it straight away. We hear that backbeat and we know the bass line and we know that song is coming on. And it is a song that you go to any disco, any nightclub, any event, wedding ceremony, like a wedding reception afterwards, and someone plays that song and it's just instantly takes people back. And you've got to remember, this was written 41 years ago, and Michael had also worked on it. And people have Quincy moaned that it was he nicked State of Independence, the bass line, and then I Can't Go For That, he licked some of the ideas. But the thing is, Billie Jean is absolutely, as much as Michael Jackson may have borrowed some ideas, it is essentially his own. And nobody, to me, apart from Chris Cornell, though he does it in a different way, has ever managed to make it as good. So Billie Jean, to me, is quintessentially, I think, one of the best pop songs of the 80s. I think it influenced the 80s a lot more than people even realise. And I think even with pop production now, people will listen to Michael Jackson and listen to Billie Jean and find things in it which they can get elements. And there's always something new in it. Even for me, since I was a child, I can still find something new in it I haven't seen before, I haven't heard before, or a little idea, or a little motif. And I think that's where Michael Jackson music is. As much as it's pop perfection, there's all these little bits in it which really build it up to this amazing ideal. So Billie Jean, my favourite song off the album. Then we go into Human Nature, which not written by Michael, and it was written by one of the members of Toto. And this idea of like a love song, but also the idea of human nature, is this song which I think the chorus, where it goes into the falsetto second part of the chorus, which is, I think, is beautiful. The idea of this song being it's quite minimal actually in a lot of ways, but what it does, it has this quaintness which is quite reflective. And it's actually quite interesting, actually after Michael Jackson died, I found that Human Nature did something for me. More people mentioned Man in the Mirror, but I thought Human Nature had something. I've always found that it was a song what was written perfectly for Michael Jackson. And even thinking of it now, I just think of it as a very poignant song with a really clear message. And it feels like a throwaway track, but it's actually, there's some really good cover versions. Shaka Khan does a cover version with Miles Davis in the 80s, which interesting, but I don't think her voice is subtle enough, where Michael's is. And the way he sang it, the technique used is really quite interesting, this breathy idea, quite unusual technique. The next song is Pretty Young Thing, and there's a demo version before which sounded very different. This was written by James Ingram, who was a great singer. He worked with Quincy Jones Productions and worked this song with Quincy Jones, and it's, again, this is another song, kind of got the mixture of Baby Be Mine, but then these ideas of this breakdown is very much like Wanna Be Starting Something. So it's kind of a mixture of the two, and it's a really poignant track, very funky. And there's a lot of stuff in it where actually you don't realise it, but when you start listening to it, there's all these little elements which just make it very beautiful. It's a very well written song, and again, this idea of this kind of making Michael hip in a certain way. But some of the ideas of the vocoder, all these ideas of the emulator, all these little vocal ideas, and then just how it feels. Again, in Stories in the Room, they show how they produce a lot of it and all the sounds they use, which are really kind of interesting ideas. It makes you kind of appreciate it more. And the last song of Thriller is The Lady in My Life, which is a ballad by Rod Temperton. The version they released only had 2 verses. I've actually got the one which has 3 verses, and I like the longer version, which is like only 7 minutes long. But it's too long for Thriller due to the time period, but obviously in CD format that would have been released. Lady of My Life is kind of, I think, probably Rod Temperton wrote it about his wife, perhaps, or he was married for many years until he died, so I would presume that was who it was about. But again, it's a ballad which people don't always respect about Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson's voice on this and his range is amazing, and his emotional intent. And so to conclude that with the album, when we're looking at music albums, a lot of things is also people have different elements of what they like, and I can understand that. So, in the 60s people liked the Beatles, in the 70s they liked David Bowie, maybe other groups, and I think in the 80s Michael Jackson, I think, emphasised something that we all loved of music. Prince and Madonna, as good as they were very much more singles artists, but I think Michael Jackson as a concept was the first person, also with Thriller, to come up with an idea that you could actually have strong songs be released as singles, but also could put them on an album and not be a greatest hits or a compilation. So I think as an influence, Michael Jackson's Thriller, to me, is not only just because it's the biggest selling album, it's also the most probably influential album of the last 40 years. And I think the template of it, the idea of the sequencing, how people release things, how they promote, how they market it, how they think of soundscapes, there's a lot to this album. And if you want to do your research, if you don't actually ask me on the video, I would send you to the right places to look at the production ideas, the vocal ideas, who do these things. And when you start studying it, as someone who's into music as a child and wanted to be a musician and a songwriter, it was to me my absolute album, which to me was so influential to me being a musician. And I can't thank Michael Jackson enough, and Quincy Jones, and all the people who involved in the project, and there was a lot. But and then obviously I will speak about Bad in another later video, and how that was slightly different, but also the similar team were in it, but how that was slightly different, a bit more about the programming and so forth, and sound wise.